Don't make me cut all of this. Happened last time. I had to do so much edit. Welcome
to
Thinking
Deeply
About
Primary
Education.
the
Podcast
That
Makes
Time.
and
Space
For
Pedagogy
Teaching.
and
Learning
Professional
Development
Anything.
of
Interest
To
Time
Poor.
but
Enthusiasm
Rich
Primary.
Teachers.
This week I'm joined by Tom Brassington,
Hello.
Shannen Doherty,
Hello.
Neil Almond,
Hello.
and Lloyd Williams Jones.
good to be back.
And this week we're going to be discussing the erosion of art, music and cooking within the curriculum. But first, Neil, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So this week I am reading something called Implementing Mastery Learning, 3rd edition by Gusky. It's a well-known book. I think, yes, that's to say it's the 3rd edition, so it's quite an old book, but in the time of COVID, it's kind of been updated to reflect the needs from that, and it just, as the title suggests, just talks about how mastery learning, as in the model of schooling as encouraged by Benjamin Bloom, how we can make that a reality in our classrooms. I'm enjoying it, some new things and some, understanding, going back over some ideas that I knew, but it's always good to hear them from, Gusky, who is an absolute source when it comes to mastery learning. Tom, what are you reading for?
I'm reading a book called Worth Dying For, The Power and Politics of Flags by Tim Marshall of Prisoners of Geography fame. Fantastic book that just gives a little bit more history about the flags that we see from all over the world, and just full of interesting anecdotes. But also, if you were a geography lead, I would say that it's quite helpful in terms of just adding that extra bit of hinterland to your thinking, really.
Tim is pushing the book side at a phenomenal rate because he's got the future of geography coming out soon.
Yeah.
And he's covered the power, prisoners, flags, what's left in the of geography series. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Shannen, what are you reading for?
Thank you for asking. I'm revisiting Mary Kennedy's Passing the Practice of Teaching. And Lloyd has just done a chef's kiss.
I think that might have been Lloyd's Thunderbolt.
Yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful paper. I'll let Shannon explain.
Beautiful paper that talks about teaching's 5 persistent problems as a nice lens to see teacher school improvement through. So it's a banging read if you're interested. Lloyd, what are you reading for?
Well, I'm going to talk broadly what I've been reading for. I've just finished a clinic this week on partnerships with the MPQH. Been quite an interesting unit in terms of looking specifically at collaboration with other schools, rationale and partnerships around how collaboration works across schools. I think quite often we enter, schools that aren't multi-academy trusts will be in some sort of federation or collaboration locally with other schools. And I think with all the best interest in the world, these collaborations exist and serve a purpose to bring teachers together from schools and try and pool resources and things. However, my personal experience of it as in the past has been they sometimes can end up being a little bit almost passively combative in a sense of there's a bit of one-upmanship potentially that can happen in those circles, even though you're there under the guise of support. It's I have felt a little bit of at my school we do this thing, and I really don't think that is the point of collaboration. And I think this unit really helped me understand some of the best practice around setting up partnerships properly, setting out a rationale before you enter into a collaborative partnership with other schools about what the remit of the collaboration is and what you want to do in terms of pooling. Now, I obviously understand that, with the academisation, being hot on the agenda and lots of schools moving towards that, we're looking around ourselves, but still there can be a lot to be gleaned from really powerful collaboration between primary schools. And I think if it's done properly and some of the rationale is set out and the remit is set down before you enter into these things, or revisited or formalised in current situations where there are collaborations, I just think that can bring an awful lot of power. And it's not something that when I was reading the unit, it chimed with me a little bit, because I was like, oh yeah, this really makes sense, because actually the collaborations I've been involved with, like I said before, have been potentially a little bit superficial. They were sort of there to be like, well, there has to be a collaboration for these schools because we're outward facing, but we're not actually, thinking about economies of scale, and we're not actually thinking about how we can learn and support each other with everything from teaching and learning, SEND, all across the board. So yeah, that's kind of what I was focusing on this week. Kieran, what you reading for?
So this isn't a new one by any stretch of the imagination, but I've been thinking recently about how the Twitter bubble doesn't necessarily represent our listeners. And I've recently been reading Ramble Number 6 by Neil Almond.
A classic.
It is, because I was asked to do some work on coherence in the curriculum, and you can look no further than this excellent piece on the narrative that should run through any well-constructed curriculum. So if you haven't checked it out, go to Nuts About Teaching. Well worth checking out for anyone thinking about curriculum design.
And it's called Nuts About Teaching because his last name is Almond.
But an almond isn't a nut.
Most nuts aren't actually scientifically, biologically nuts.
They're legumes.
Legumes. Yeah, damn it.
Oh, Jesus. Well, let's change the topic of this podcast. This week's episode was inspired by a report that Ed Dorrell published a while ago on... Well, they published a report, but he promoted it on Twitter, and essentially it was a survey of parents and the decisions they make around schools. And one of the things that they were concerned about was the erosion of art, music, sport, and cooking from the curriculum. And so, to what extent do you believe this to be true? And what might the reasons for this perception be?
I think there's probably an element of truth in this report in terms of the erosion of those subjects. I think we all know the difficulty of timetabling and the narrowing of the curriculum that we have seen, legacy stuff that's happened in the last 10 to 15 years of teaching in the primary sector. And I feel that some schools have fallen probably victim to that a little bit, that narrowing, and have pushed out some of these subjects as well. Now, timetabling is probably its own episode in a sense that it's a very, very challenging thing. And I think it's a persistent problem for schools. Like Shannen said, persistent problems are something that, schools are continually having to battle. You're never really ever going to solve it. However, you can just continually work to iterate and be better at addressing the problem. And I feel that's a massive, massive part of probably potentially some of the causation around why they have been eroded a little bit. Now, again, I'm not speaking for every school here. There are plenty of schools across the land that have excellent provision for these subjects.
Name one.
I say there's lots of schools doing it really well. I'm making a sweeping generalisation there about this based on hunch of what I know of my lived experience of schools, and I would, welcome the opinions of the esteemed guests that I'm sat with today.
No, I think you're right, because my last school built cooking into the DT curriculum, and so time was carved out for pupils in all year groups to progressively develop their skills in that aspect. I don't know if that... I remember doing home economics when I was at secondary school, and we would have to do that X number of hours, maybe 90 minutes a week for the first 4 or 5 years of secondary school. So I have seen, you're talking about schools doing this. So even if cooking can make it into a DT curriculum, then there must be room for the others as well. Tom, we've talked about the performing arts in the past. It feels a lot like that if these things are being eroded. What are your thoughts?
If it lands at the teacher's door to make those sort of decisions, then you've probably got a bit of a problem, because teachers don't have lots of time. Teachers are having to make lots of decisions about what they do within a day. I think it almost has to happen alongside and with teachers, but the decision needs to be something that is almost done for them, because timetabling is important, but also resources and things like that for these sort of things are really, really important as well. And if you've not got a well-resourced curriculum for art or for music, or you haven't got access to ovens, you're not going to be able to cook. So you've got to think carefully about the sort of resources that are needed for those sort of things. I think that's really important. But also, there's perhaps a conversation to be had there about specialisms, and particularly around music. I think there's an argument that you could have people coming in to deliver those sort of sessions. If the staff feel unequipped, you've got to consider the professional development there as well. And how are you going to upskill your staff so that they don't feel like it's going to be the lesson that they cut off the timetable? Because if you feel that you've got lots to do and there's not enough time for you to get through all your lessons in a week, naturally the thing that you're going to get rid of is the thing you feel least equipped to deliver. So I think there's a conversation to be had with your staff team about what are you finding difficult to teach, what don't you feel that you have the skills to teach, and how can we build that into an effective professional development programme that's going to upskill everybody so that that's no longer a deficit that exists in your school team.
I would love for someone to ask me what I find difficult. It would be computing, and I would get rid of it. Or I'd have someone come in and do it for me, which I think lends itself to your point about specialisms. I think particularly with music, even art to an extent, there are teachers who are not remotely creative and yet are expected to model quite at times complex things. Same with cooking. I know people that don't cook, can't cook, even with a recipe, don't know what they're doing. And we're having to juggle so many subjects in a short period of time. And to be able to deliver history, geography, science, cooking, music, art, sport, maths, English, phonics, everything to a high standard, you're spot on. The PD has to be the priority, but most schools don't have the time, the money, the inclination. And unfortunately, lots of leaders just sit there and say, "Well, you need to do it because what's your cooking unit?" Well, I don't know. What have I actually got? I was thinking with Lloyd's point about the narrowing of the curriculum. So we've seen a narrowing of the curriculum, and then recently we've obviously seen a widening of the curriculum, but I think like a wild overcomplication of some areas of the curriculum. And I'm all for high quality, rigorous curriculums that means staff have things to plan from, high quality resources that they didn't have before. They're not having to reinvent the wheel. They're not having to work from scratch. But when you're talking about music and art and cooking and sport, I'm not sure we need as complicated a curriculum as some schools are developing or feel they have to develop because of documents that came out from a certain organisation with questions and vocabulary on them that children are expected to learn and teachers are expected to deliver. I think if you're thinking about cooking can be a really joyful thing and the kids can have a lot of fun doing it. And they might come out and they might have learned a few things that they can do at home and show off to their parents and their families. But do they need to have a really lengthy progression document for cooking? Probably not. Same with other subjects, I'd imagine.
I think as well you need to consider what parts of the curriculum that are in the national curriculum actually just, for some schools, might just be totally unfeasible. Just thinking about music, I believe that there is an expectation that children do see live music. And I don't know why you find that quite funny, Mr. Mackle. However, if you're a small little rural school and you have, don't have those things nearby, straight away you can't fulfill the requirements of the national curriculum. Just going back to DT for a moment in regards to food, I was on a DT course last Wednesday provided by the DT Association. And it's their recommendation actually that food is one of the strands that is taught in every year group. And so obviously you need to think, I guess, of what that progression is from EYFS to year 6 for food. If it's a recommendation, but obviously the subject associations there should be the teacher's friend. So it'd be an interesting one to think about what progression does look like in food, because obviously you can't just have the kids making the classic fruit kebab.
Kebabs. It's always a fruit kebab. They learn cutting skills. There you go. There's your progression.
Different style cuts.
Different knife lengths. I think, you might consider a progression and you might have some progression in mind, but I don't think that you then need to produce progression documents that, from every part of your body, because that's what people coming in grilling you about DT want to see. I think there's a pressure on leaders, subject leaders, school leaders, teachers delivering DT, that they know every millimetre of that progression. And I think that's unfair for certain subjects that could just be more about the enrichment of it all.
I was smiling because of how unrealistic it is, Neil. I was agreeing with you. That laugh was, how can we all make live music a thing? I mean, suppose village pubs might have a live band. You might get the live band into school.
I just think, after dark school trip. Right, kids, we're going to go see the local band. I'll see you outside the pub door at 7 o'clock for a 7:30 start.
There's a really good band in Kent that I know of called Papa's Antiportus. That could be a school trip. So I'm just saying that,
maybe that is your niche.
Yeah.
That's you just on
we're providing the cultural sort of the cultural literacy for 7-year-olds for understanding Pearl Jam.
This voice you're doing sounds like it's Flight of the Conchords. There's a really great band called Papa's Antiportus.
Band meeting. Shiny.
I would love to see a greater depth progression where you had year 6 kids doing that, those Japanese sword cooking, where they're like,
Isn't that a game? Isn't that a game on the iPad?
These kids are greater depth in cooking because they are literally chopping stuff in the middle of the air. That would be awesome.
But that's an excellent point. What is greater depth cooking?
We don't know what greater depth is in most
Souffle.
subjects. Never mind.
It's not a thing anyway.
Nobody knows what great depth is in
It's
pretty
just
much any
knowing.
subject.
But I'm looking around this room, right, and we are all pretty musical, and even to describe us as musical means that at some point in our lives we have spent a long time practicing whatever instrument we are proficient at, and I think that goes to all your points in terms of, the expertise you need, Tom and Shannon, think about where's this time coming from. I was 13 when I got my first guitar, and I'm still probably okay at it, but, it'll take me another 20 years if I really wanted to master it. So, if we're expecting this across lots of subjects, I'm not sure how reasonable that expectation is.
What I will add in terms of that report, I was surprised by the sports side of it, because I do think the PE is quite, I don't know, my lived experience of it is like, PE is like pretty like protected in terms of that happening in a week regularly, and the whole 2-hour thing happening.
It's more than when I
week.
started teaching.
Right. Like, I don't know. It just feels to me that part of it isn't eroded. I don't know. Like PE still strikes me. I don't know. How do others feel about that?
I totally agree that PE is protected and ring-fenced, that time, that funding, you get coaches coming in. But I wonder if it is, so physical education is happening, but I wonder if it's the sport element and the team element that parents feel like is lacking. Because if I think about the schools that I've worked in, most of them don't have teams, whereas when I was at school, I was on the football team, the netball team. I was actually the most improved player in year 3 for football.
Congratulations, Shannon.
Thank you. But I was on...
Excellent use of the button.
Was it the clap?
Yeah, big cheer for me. Thank you. I really appreciate that. But football, netball, basketball, I had access to all of those teams, and I don't know what my parents were paying, if they were paying for it, but there was an opportunity, whereas I haven't worked at schools where there are after-school teams for football, where they go and play against other schools, there aren't tournaments, there are competitions. I think that's probably lacking. But I think in some schools it's probably really prominent, and it's probably a big part of the school, depending on where they are and the demographic, I guess.
So curveball then, right? Because back home, the sports leagues were well established. Possibly, I don't know if 100 years is an exaggeration, but these schools have been there for a long time, and they'd been playing against each other in different sports for a long time. Do you think then it's become the preserve of the private school, where sports and learning instruments to a proficient level are things that only they can afford to do? I mean, I know it's a curveball. What are your thoughts? Has it sort of been, is that why they're worried? Because only one part of society is provided with access to this on a regular basis?
I think it has to be part of the problem. The problem is the way you want to kind of frame that, because peripatetic sports coaches, beyond what you may have in your school already, because of the sports premium, comes at a cost, and you can try as much as you will to, get peripathetics in or other, additional sports coaches to do those things after school. But, the minute you start charging as a school to do those things, all of a sudden you're, as a school, you're branded as kind of widening that gap because you're not necessarily providing access to all of those pupils who may be on a, pupil premium because you're spending your pupil premium, allocation in, other ways that you think is going to, close that gap. You're then accused of, widening that gap again. So for me, I can't really see how state school with, current budgets, how, what we can really do, bar, perhaps, the bucket goes around at the end of every, nativity play and every kind of time, the kids do a little poetry recite or whatever, just to try and create additional funds, that way.
Yeah, because I think we've recently had a look in our school at the DT curriculum in particular. We've redesigned it using a booklet model, but we found that we're halfway through the year and we can't afford to resource the curriculum that we planned. We need to therefore have to rethink all of our curriculum budgeting to ensure that our children are getting those opportunities. And I think maybe there is an argument about the sort of the disadvantage gap that we build there potentially. I was at the Church of England conference yesterday listening to Sonia Thompson talk about what's in a child's backpack when they come to school and how can we build that backpack. And actually, it's really important that those sort of opportunities are there for children. You wouldn't have the artists and the musicians that you do have who are successful without those opportunities for them. But at the same time, we also need them to be able to read, write, and be numerate as well. And so I think sometimes the narrative is framed as if it's an either or, whereas actually we do need to be a lot more smarter, I think, in terms of how we can be integrating some of these subjects in meaningful ways into the core subjects as well.
Tom has a really good point there about budgeting. Like, I think that's a like curriculum budgeting and proper school budgeting in terms of forecasting and committing stuff to budget is a really hard thing to do. And I don't know that schools do it particularly well because, committing your costs ahead of the financial year and that sort of stuff is really key, as you've just illustrated perfectly. You get to a point where your school business manager won't look you in the eye anymore because, and you just sort of, you hide from her in the staff room or him in the staff room because, you've got to put a stonking order of conductors in or whatever it is, like electrical components for that really expensive DT unit in year 5, but it is really, really important. And I think that is that's a bigger argument. It probably feeds into what you were kind of teasing at in a sense of funding and in terms of how we ring fence money for budget and how middle leaders are able to be trained and supported to forecast and commit to budget, and that actually is factored into school development plans, so that part of the plan is right. Let's spend a lot of time with our middle leaders here and invest in their training, their understanding of budgeting, so that we get a really good understanding of where all our money is being spent and how we're going to ensure that the enacted curriculum is what we is what we intended, sort of thing. So.
It's depressing how many of the conversations I have with people, because we've done hundreds of hours of recording onto that bit, and so many of them come back to underfunding. SEN, that green paper episode we did with Adam and Sue, we'd love to fund that, but there's no money for that. The episode we did, Tom, on the performing arts, that costs money, and actually at the minute, it's not even just the socially disadvantaged who are suffering in society. The middle classes are being squeezed too. So you've almost only got one part of society who are able to ride out the current economic storm. So, I don't think the point of this podcast is to make a decision on what's happening and how we can fix this. It's just a question of, is this happening? And it seems like all roads lead to funding whenever we talk about the issues in schools. And, I don't see that improving certainly in the short term.
I think there are a few nice threads we can pull from this conversation. One, going back to what Lloyd said about collaboration, and I think you can look at this in terms of both as a group of academies of no matter what size, or if you're LA schools and you within certain geographical distance from each other, that some sort of shared curriculum would potentially allow you to. Going back to Shannen's idea about progression documents. I'm not saying, you need to have the detail, but, if you said in year 4 they're going to build ABC and cook XYZ, and you did that throughout the whole curriculum, then that helps with budgeting, because you at least kind of know what the resources that will be needed are going to be.
I just want to point out that I was never suggesting we don't know what they're going to cook in each year group.
I wasn't suggesting
I'd
that
like
you didn't
to
know
make
that.
that clear.
Awkward.
I have to do this again now. I'm not saying that you didn't say.
Steady cook.
Having an idea of end products within the curriculum will help schools, evidently budget for the future. One, I say, if you are in an academy trust, or you have some schools around you and you decide to share that curriculum, then obviously the more you buy, the cheaper it generally is. So you could, I'm not saying this solves the problem, far from it, but one way to kind of think about these things is to, share that DT curriculum. You know what you need to buy, and bulk ordering does make it a little bit cheaper. That's something that we're going to try and do with the 3 or 4 schools in at Step, and we'll kind of see how that goes. But again, we are concerned that we'll be in the same situation that Tom mentioned, that we'll plan this curriculum out and then we'll realise it's unfundable. Interestingly, going back onto that that course from the DT Association, they said that their kind of suggested budget is £3.80 per pupil per unit is what you should be able to looking to spend to resource everything, which I thought was...
Have we done the maths?
Well, it's 4 times 6 times 30.
For DT specifically.
Yes, for DT.
So 4 times 6, 24.
24.
Times 3.
72.
Times 10.
720.
Times
three.
200. Times 3.
3 units.
I was going 6 units.
So we're going to do 3. We again, because things are unworkable otherwise, we're going to
Is
do...
that? But were they saying 6 units or
No. They, to be fair, no, they don't recommend 6 units. They appreciate that the likelihood it's going to go art one term, DT another term, art.
4 times 3 times 30. 360.
And then that's one
Yeah, 'cause it's
that's one class.
So 360 times 7.
That's about £2,500.
I don't know if that's a lot or not, or if it's realistic.
I mean, we got 2 budget holders in the room. What do you guys think?
So we're saying £2,500 for DT.
Do you have £2,500 to pay for DT?
You could make it so that you had 2,500 for DT, but it would be at the cost of another subject.
Exactly.
You'd pull from another pot. So I know what Neil's saying though. In terms of costing, it's an expensive subject. DT, you've got the perishable element with food, and obviously then components, and then there's the argument of, are we letting the children take home the finished product, or are we breaking down the product to recycle for other year groups? There's all these kind of ethical decisions, if you will, around DT, which I mean, it's a bit strong ethical, but there are decisions to make from a budgetary perspective in terms of what you do as a school. I know some schools take contributions for DT, and then they allow the children to take the product home, so it offsets some of the costs. But it's what is as a school and your community, and understanding your community as well, and what decisions you want to make around that. But yeah, I mean, 2,500 would be quite a lot from a budgetary perspective for my school, for my position. It may not be for a bigger school, potentially a London school with funding matrix and stuff, matrices and things. So I think there's lots of considerations. There's no hard and fast answer, but I mean, that would seem a lot in terms of.
Just on your point about them taking the product home, I really sincerely hope that no one is making an apple crumble with the year 4 class and then decomposing it and letting the other year groups use the components for their next unit.
Should we remove them entirely from the curriculum? Some successful systems have a core, 3 or 4 subjects in their curriculum, and then use the afternoons for intervention, while others run enrichment type sessions to allow pupils to experience or develop expertise in one particular area. Think about violins. There might be something takes a long time to develop expertise in, and piano too. Why not us? I mean, obviously this is the max model of 3 subjects. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am.
I really like the focus on reading, writing, arithmetic. And I think that's, you know, we should be ensuring our children leave reading, writing and being numerate, and I think those should be our priorities. But I also think we need to show them the wider world and expose them to all the wonderful things in the world and the different things that they can try and do, so that they go to secondary school knowing what they're into, and they've got an idea of what instrument they like, or what sport they like playing, or if they're creative or artistic, or if they're musical, or if they sing, those sorts of things. But I think there's a better balance to be had than the current model of trying to squeeze 100 subjects into 5 days. It's not feasible. It's not sustainable. And I think we do need to find a better balance, and we need to find which subjects we really want to push in quite an academic way, and which subjects we want to push in a more creative, enriching way. And maybe that's nationally, maybe that's schools that make that decision themselves based on what they think their school's kind of USP can be. But I don't think the current model is creating the literate and numerate adults of society, or enriching them fully either.
The GCSEs have been designed in such a way that the foundation is the very minimum you need to survive in the world. Like Matt was saying to me the other day at the primary maths conference for LaSalle, if you're mathematically enumerate, you make worse decisions. On top of the boundary between a C and D at GCSE, 2021 study showed that is the biggest determining factor between future earnings. So on top of the money you're losing from your job, you're also picking a worse mortgage. You're getting yourself into debt, and you're essentially losing the game of life because of your innumeracy. You know, that conversation shouldn't be happening in 2023. You know, we talk about every pupil being able to achieve well in mathematics. They certainly should be able to be functionally numerate in mathematics. That shouldn't be up for debate.
And the relevance of that was?
Well, Shannon's saying about people leaving school, numerate and literate, you know, so we're talking about those 3 R's. A child leaving primary school, enumerate and illiterate, is unacceptable.
It's criminal.
That's what I'm saying.
Absolutely criminal that anyone is leaving primary school unable to read or do the maths to a standard of a year 6 child, and then even more criminal that they're leaving secondary school having learned no more maths on top of that. And I think you're right. That
with a caveat around SEND,
of course. Some people have significant barriers to their learning, and that we need to understand. So we need to say, when we think about all our children, we're thinking most of our children. But we still need to provide them these enriching experiences. Otherwise, they may never know what they want to be in life, or just they might not know what they do for fun. You know, we all had opportunities at primary school. Like I said, netball team, football team. I learnt the guitar. I was in musicals, that sort of thing. If that hadn't have been available to me, and it was just reading, writing, and arithmetic, I don't know. I probably wouldn't be the person I am now, because I wouldn't have known I wanted to do those things. So we need to have a balance, is what my point was.
I think what probably needs to be considered in all this is that, you know, we are primary teachers, and primary is, as the name suggests, you know, the first stage. There is potentially, at minimum, I think now, an additional 7 years of education that they can get when they leave primary school and go to secondary school. And obviously, should they wish to continue after secondary school to sixth form, university after that, maybe, you know, that can be the time. During that time, rather, that can be the time that they can really kind of dive into all these kind of nice extracurricular things where, because secondary schools have more capacity, they can do the PE bits and pieces. And, you know, the musicals, because the drama department is there, they have the lighting, the music department provides the music for it, and those kind of things just can't happen at most primary schools because the lack of the expertise and, you know, as we talked about earlier on, lack of resources. So, quite honestly, as much as I enjoy all of these things, maybe less so PE, but, you know, everything else, if in the mornings, like the focus was, as Kieran said, like, you know, your 3 hours, and in the afternoon, not saying that then is a continuation, but, you know, there are things that they can do, enrichment to a certain extent that isn't putting on plays and performances and the additional subjects that we have right now, I honestly don't think it would be such a bad thing.
In Singapore, the school day is 7:30 to 1:30. So you've got mathematics, your mother language, and English, and then the afternoon is enrichment from outside agencies. Imagine what your workload would be like if you. I wouldn't mind teaching at 7:30 in the morning if I knew that my day, in terms of having a full class, finished at 1:30. I mean, how better would your work-life balance be if you only had to focus on that?
I think work-life balance might be better, and I also wouldn't mind teaching at 7:30. But going to Neil's point about the issue being resources and expertise and maybe funding as well, I don't think we need to be in a position where we should just accept that that's the state we're in and that's the state we're always going to be in. I think it would also be a crime for children to leave primary school not having had experiences in sport and music and art. And I think that our job is to create sort of numerate, literate children who are well-rounded, who have a good idea of what's happening in the world, who have interests and are interesting and can talk about things and can take part in performances and all of that jazz, because that is actually, it's okay to have fun as well. I'd be really upset if my child didn't have access to some enriching things as well. And I don't think we can go, we just don't have the resources for it, so it's not going to happen. We have to make a system where it does happen and where we can get that balance right.
I think it might come down a little bit to curriculum as well. There is so much in the curriculum for us to teach, as well as the fact that we aren't at the moment getting everybody to be able to read or write or be numerate. And I think if you've got that position where the curriculum is so overwhelming, you've got to maybe look at these subjects like art and music, perhaps sport's slightly different, but art, music, cooking, you've got to look at these sort of things and think, well, are there ways that we can make them accessible for children, the primariness of primary, all that sort of stuff? Are there ways that we can think about what we do in primary schools and have more of a focus on that and almost whet their appetite for these things as things that they want to go on to develop? Because ultimately you don't become a fantastic piano player or a fantastic dancer when you're 4 years old. You have to hone that skill. But you do need a little bit of early intervention in terms of people who inspire you to do that. And I wonder, when we've got a profession where people are so overworked, where the curriculum's so overcrowded, whether teachers actually have the time to be that inspiring adult in some subjects for those people. And a lot of teachers don't have particular skill sets for those certain subjects as well. If you've got an art teacher who says at the start of the lesson, I'm not very good at drawing, then you're going to set that child up to a very uninspiring lesson. Our core business should be in those reading, writing and maths. But I think there is an element of re-looking at what we already do in primary that enriches music or art for these children and saying that's enough. Because every school's doing a nativity, every school's doing some artwork in some kind of gallery or things like that. Well, maybe that's okay and maybe that's enough, and that's to start them off, and then maybe specialists later down the line could pick up and hone the skills.
We can track our listeners and the listens that an episode will get based on the time of year. So you can tell when people are exhausted, because those weeks there are less people listening or fewer people listening than when they're fresh. Like for instance, first week of term 1, loads of people listening. First week of term 3, loads of people listening. Christmas, it's depressing. But you could track, and it feels like when I first started teaching, we had the capacity to go wherever we wanted, when we wanted, and we get chicken dinners. And we went to training in like Priestfield and Gillingham and stuff like that. There, now it's a struggle to get anybody out of school because things are just stretched to the wall. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I totally get your point about exhaustion, because it feels like things have not been as intense as this in my 15 years of teaching.
I think we can look as well at the wider issue perhaps as to why is this necessarily a school problem? Why is it the role of school to introduce these specific things to children where it could be something that, as I say, greater collaboration between schools and perhaps the third sector, the charity sector, who could potentially do some, I'm not saying that they don't do anything, of course I'm not. There's plenty of charities that do absolutely wonderful things, but, with more, comes back to funding again, with more funding, perhaps it's them that can help support deliver these things to a far better standard than I could inspire anyone about, cooking or, things like that.
But you could inspire someone when it comes to guitar and music, and you inspire people when it comes to history. So surely you should be able to share that.
I don't think Kieran's model necessarily means that I couldn't, or what I would want means that I couldn't get some of that in through a reading lesson or something like that. Or, I'd be happy, if my working hours were 7:30 to 1:30 one day a week, I would absolutely happy do an hour of history club or something like that, where we learn more about that, and those kids that, maybe in the first term, everyone has to do certain things, and then, perhaps, they get to pick the ones that they're, particularly interested in. Just say the charity sector comes in and does some of those things that, teachers can't necessarily offer. So I think there's maybe a wider discussion of, what should schools teach, which is, never an easy one to, certainly what should primary schools teach, which is never an easy one to answer. And I don't actually know if that debate, we've talked about schools before, but I think that debate automatically gets put into a secondary lens, but having that conversation about, what should primary schools teach would be quite an interesting one.
There is that persistent problem of, how much is too much within a curriculum, and we are at a position with the primary curriculum at the moment where so much has been added to it, isn't it, over the last 10 years. It's completely saturated, and at the cost of some of these things. And like you said, there is an argument there about whose responsibility it is to be delivering some of this stuff. Now, obviously we've got to consider disadvantaged pupils, and we've got to consider vulnerable children who won't get experiences to these things at home. But it's a very, very difficult situation in the sense of the cost-benefit analysis again. What you cut in order to be able to, boost something else. And that lays on school leaders to be able to make these decisions around how much time is devoted to each of the subjects and where everything's put in and so on and so forth. And you can come under scrutiny for not having enough of certain thing, and and it's often the way that you're not doing enough. You're not doing enough PSHE. You're not doing enough cooking here. I'm not seeing enough progression in cooking. And the bottom line is, there's a million different setups in the UK around in UK and English schools, and around how they operate their timetable. So like a regulation on this, and a kind of like the inspector coming in and asking questions around like, why has this been on, why is that, is really, really, really challenging. And there's an argument there for reducing. I definitely agree with there needs to be some reducing. But I also agree with Shannen in a sense of like we need to preserve, and Tom as well, we need to preserve that right to cultural literacy and that right to experience things that their peers will experience on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis at home. Hope we're off to the castle this weekend. That kind of thing. That stuff is vital for some of our children in the UK. So it's a really divisive subject. This, in a sense, of like, but I also echo the sentiment of the 3 R's as well. It's absolutely essential that children are literate and numerate. We've got to make we owe that to them to be coming through. So it's there is no nice answer to this, is there? And it's another persistent problem that schools face in terms of balance. And I think there needs to be a constant iteration around this in terms of like how we reflect and understand curriculum and curricula, and what we provide for children, because it's a very, very difficult thing, and that every teacher in the land wants the best from children, in terms of like outcomes, and the curricula is a vehicle to provide the best for children. Mm-hmm. So, and it's so contentious. Curriculum is so contentious about what value we place on certain elements of the curriculum. It's a difficult situation. It's a difficult conversation.
I mean, yeah. It's probably the KMAC paradox. Everyone has an entitlement to that cultural literacy, not cultural capital, cultural literacy, and everyone has an entitlement to know about the rich heritage of our country, the geographic sort of knowledge that makes Britain what it is, and science and all that stuff. But at the very least, we need people who are able to make sensible decisions when they're adults, based on the ability to read and the ability to count and work with numbers. So the KMAC paradox, as we're now going to call it. To try and engage with the sort of underserved subjects, I sort of said on New Year's Eve or the day before New Year's Eve that I wanted to read up on things like DT and stuff to try and get more information out there to our listeners. But the more I've read, it feels a bit like a minefield of 21st century skills and schools or prisons. So it seems like the people who are keen to write about this stuff are very keen on things that aren't actually real things. Do experts in these fields need to catch up with other subjects? And if they don't, do they risk complete erosion?
Just a bit of an anecdote here of something that was told by a teacher who attended a DT course, was that for the first 30 to 40 minutes of this DT course, the person who is leading it played a Ken Robinson video of famed TED Talk about creativity. They didn't get the whole school to prison pipeline or anything like that, but then they were shown then the Dale's cone of experience, the whole you remember 5% of what you read, 10% of what you
Yeah, well, I mean, if you Google, I don't know, ridiculous scientific, I don't know, what is it? It's an example of self-citation, because if you look at the references in Dale's cone of experience, you get back to a picture of Dale's cone of experience. It's the same about the one where, where it says like you should instruct in kindergarten for 5 minutes, then in the next grade for 10 minutes. That one just goes back to the same table. So it is, undergraduate psychology. Here's an example of bad science.
I know that this person did explain all of that on their feedback that they got to give at the end of the course, and I know that they were very clear with what the issues were around all of that were. So to answer your question, I mean, based on this one person's experience, it certainly seems that case that there is the sense that those more artistic subjects seem to more likely than not have that frame of reference where creativity itself is some sort of generic skill that if only we could tap into it and provide students these even just these experiences that will unlock this nugget of creativity that is held within inside all children that just needs to seemingly be unlocked, and the only way for it possibly to be unlocked is through these quote unquote creative subjects, which personally I don't think holds dear, because I know again from what this person told me that the reasons why the course leader was talking about DT and all the kind of wonderful creative things that it can lead to, certainly if you had a good command of numeracy, mathematics could be just as creative. If you had a good command of writing and a good vocabulary, like you could certainly be as creative as this person was explaining that DT offers within those kind of core subjects as well.
I think when the sort of more crazy side of this and the crazy claims that go out there are that maths and music are intrinsically linked, but if you only ever played a kid Vivaldi and never showed them numbers, they wouldn't be able to do maths. So it doesn't work, does it? So I think you have to make sure that there's a real balance there. I think I've probably had quite a big shift in my thinking on this, because probably 6 or 7 years ago, that creativity thing, I would have snapped that up. I'd have been tweeting all about that, saying, this is exactly what matters to our children. And a lot of it probably came down to thinking about their self-esteem and their well-being. And my experience at school, I never felt more excited to be in school than in a music class or in a drama class, because it was my thing. But actually, when you think about the self-esteem thing a little bit more carefully, there's nothing more demeaning and more damaging to a child's self-esteem, I think, than not being able to do the things that you're asking them to do every single day for the most amount of time. So your maths, your reading, your writing, if they're going into their days, and the majority of their days they're spending thinking, I can't do this, and then they might get their hour of art where they can show off, it makes no difference to their self-esteem, because actually in that 1 hour of art where they can show off, it's only an hour a week. There's no opportunity to show off in that. So I think we want to, where I've landed probably is that you want to be able to build up that literacy and numeracy in our children so that they feel confident to be able to go and explore the world and explore the opportunities that can arise from music education or art education, or with a place at the table and a voice to be heard, rather than robbing them of the chance to do that, really.
I mean, it strikes me that, sport has probably embraced this the most, because it's a very good example of when direct instruction is effective. But it strikes me like DT, art, they're probably the subject that lend themselves to direct instruction the most. I'm thinking of any great artist, they need to be very, very proficient in the basic skills before they became, like you say, creative. And that moment we realize that creativity is domain specific, that's a watershed moment. And it feels like, we've been hearing this message for a long time. And if those subjects don't catch up with that, because there's a thing about DT's got 4 years left. I'm not surprised. Every blog I see seems to see design and technology as the way to save the planet is to know design and technology, because we're going to design the thing that will save us. And I don't know, probably a reality check is in order. I wish they would realize that actually, if I want to design things really well, I need to be instructed in how to design things, and perhaps some skills will transfer. But if I'm really good at designing buildings, that doesn't necessarily mean I can design a bridge. Not primary examples, not even school examples, but hopefully metaphors that work.
I think, it's a really interesting question in terms of those subjects that are potentially eroding or being eroded in the curriculum. We rolled out our art curriculum that we've just redesigned on Friday, and part of that curriculum is this idea of exploration, which is really important in art. And I was discussing with my art lead about how giving children the space and time to explore with art is really, really important. But we also debated around what was considered to be good art, and how society has considered some of the great artists of our time to be beautiful and to be good and to be incredible pieces of art that express something. And there was a real debate around that, and this idea of exploration. But when we are, when we look at art and we think about these subjects and think about this idea of creativity and how we need to give children space for that, there was always as well an element of children being able to know things as well about art, because if you don't understand some of the artistic vocabulary, and some of the concepts in art, like foreground and background and perspective, and some of that vocabulary and language, then yes, you can be creative, and yes, I can express what I'm doing, but from the subject discipline of art, in terms of what we consider to be to be good, and what's made those artists what we all consider as a society to be an impressive piece of art, there's been techniques and knowledge learned there that that has happened. So it was a real interesting debate with her that we had back and forth in terms of ensuring, and we spoke to our staff about that, and ensuring that, that we do make sure that is specified in terms of, when I am doing a line drawing or I'm doing a continuous line drawing, that my pen doesn't leave the page. Things like that, that makes that art form what it is. And if you don't know that, then you're not necessarily going to be able to replicate something in your own design, your own creativity, but in that form. So I don't know. There's a real interesting debate there around that. I'm definitely on the side which I think comes back to that idea of, it's not all just loose and free and off we go. There has to be some element there of what we know and understand and agree as a society to be excellent.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to a blog that I wrote in maybe 2016-17 that no one read, and it was about Beethoven's 25th Concerto. And essentially, he broke the rules of the concerto. And only if you had the knowledge to understand that he had broken the rules of the concerto would you appreciate why his thing was brilliant. Because this in 1800s was like, oh my God, I can't believe. Because essentially, the piano will come in, the orchestra will come in, and then you will begin the themes. But he had the piano and the orchestra fight each other the whole way through the start. And only if you know the stuff that goes behind that do you realize what he's done, because otherwise it just sounds like a song, doesn't it? So creativity and the knowledge are absolutely essential.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think every prog musician was proficient in 4/4, 6/8 and maybe 12/8 before they then started to experiment with any other kind of wild and crazy time signatures, and you certainly couldn't rush to 12/16 or something like that, or 11/16 without that kind of core fundamental understanding of, certainly from the Western perspective of music, 4/4, 6/8 or 12/8.
This is the thing that bothers me about the experts in these fields, or the people you see on Twitter, or even like authors sometimes who are very anti the curriculum movement in primary schools. They all have had an education where they learnt to read, they learnt to write, they learnt to be numerate. They had access to the things that we are giving our children access to. If you think about people who, like authors of children's books, and some of whom are very, very vocal about how awful primary schools are at the moment, but all of the references that are in their books have come from what they learn in school and the experience that they've had. And ultimately, all we're trying to do with our children is give them the richest experience that they've got, or they could have, to make them the most well-rounded young people. And it really bothers me that they kind of completely ignore the fact that they had these experiences growing up, or they had access to these things growing up, and that's just what we're doing now. And yes, it's not perfect, like we've said. There are funding issues, and there are timetabling issues, and there's an issue with like overcomplicating things. But if you're going to be proficient, or you're going to be creative, you have to be proficient. And to be proficient, you have to learn how to do it, and you have to be instructed and coached how to do it. So that I think your question, the experts in these fields, I think they do need to get with the programme a little bit and actually meet teachers halfway, rather than just poo-pooing all the stuff that we're doing.
I mean, on that note, I think it's time to bring this very not enlightening, interesting conversation, because at most it could be a conversation, because none of us in this room have the answers, but it's a conversation worth having, and I hope that this conversation continues, because at some point we will reach a critical point where it's too late to have this conversation and to have this discussion, and so I hope that this can act as a catalyst. All that's left to do is say thank you very much to our Ko-fi subscribers. Tom, you're one of them. I really appreciate it. We are very close to having our own roadcaster, which is the thing that Brewdog would allow us to record our live podcasts on. And now that means we can bring live podcasts on a more regular basis. So for that, we are very, very appreciative. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to my guests. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Shannen.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Pleasure as always.
Thank you, Neil.
It's been fantastic. Thank you.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.